The internal struggle between these two poles became increasingly intense. This duality led him to a dilemma. Either he accepted that life was meaningless and continued living in despair, or he found a new way of seeing the world that allowed him to move forward. It was a choice between nihilism and faith, emptiness and hope. It was then that he made a radical decision. He would abandon his previous beliefs and devote himself entirely to the search for new meaning. It was not enough to just study religions or try to understand them intellectually. He needed to live them. This was the moment when Tolstoy began to completely change his life. He began to question not only his beliefs, but also his lifestyle, his values, and his priorities. He was ready to take a definitive step towards discovering the true meaning of life. However, this journey was still far from over. What did Tolstoy find in his search? What conclusions did he draw from this experience?
Royal Prestige, nunca dejas de sorprenderte.
Abrir una cuenta de cheques nunca ha sido tan fácil. Solo pregúntale a Penny. Ella ya está aprovechando de los beneficios de...
Important notes. We're gonna get ourselves all the way bonus attack speed.
And above all, what can we learn from this transformation? These are the questions we will answer in the next topic. 2. The search for answers. Science, religion, and philosophy. After realizing that his life was plunged into emptiness, Tolstoy began a tireless search for answers. He didn't want to simply accept life as it was. He needed to find meaning for his existence. He decided to explore three main paths: science, religion, and philosophy. At first, Tolstoy placed his faith in science. He believed that scientific knowledge could provide a logical explanation for life. During his research, he studied theories of biology, physics, and astronomy, trying to understand if there was a greater purpose in the universe. However, science only reinforced their anguish. She explained how things worked, but not why. Biology told him that living beings existed through evolutionary processes, but it did not answer what the purpose of human life was. Astronomy showed a vast and indifferent universe, where human existence seemed insignificant. Tolstoy realized that science was powerful in explaining natural phenomena, but it was incapable of answering the deepest questions of the soul. He wrote that scientists could tell him as a tree grew, but not because it existed. This led him to look elsewhere for answers. The second path he explored was philosophy. He immersed himself in the works of great thinkers, from ancient Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to modern philosophers such as Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. He found many brilliant reflections, but no definitive answers. Some philosophers argued that life had a purpose, while others insisted that there was no meaning to existence. The variety of ideas confused him even more. How could there be so many different answers to the same question? Tolstoy realized that philosophy was fascinating, but it was often lost in abstract theories that did not offer a practical solution to the human dilemma. He wanted something that was more than an intellectual debate. I wanted something that could truly transform your life. Then, he turned his gaze to the third path, religion. Despite being raised within the Russian Orthodox Christian tradition, Tolstoy had never taken religion very seriously. Now, in the midst of his existential crisis, he decided to study it in more depth. He began with the Gospels, trying to understand the message of Jesus Christ without the influence of the church. What impressed him most was the emphasis on love, compassion, and detachment from material possessions. He saw in this a possible answer to his anguish. Perhaps the meaning of life was not in reason or knowledge, but rather in doing good and connecting with others. However, Tolstoy did not limit himself to Christianity. He expanded his search to other religions, studying Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and even Taoism. In all these traditions, he found something in common: the idea that human beings should transcend their ego and live in harmony with something greater than himself. He was especially intrigued by the teachings of Buddhism and Indian philosophy. The idea that suffering came from attachment and that true peace lay in the renunciation of desire made a lot of sense to him. Tolstoy began to realize that perhaps he was looking for happiness in the wrong place. With each new discovery, his worldview began to change. He realized that his existential crisis did not come from a lack of answers, but from the way he approached life. As I tried to find meaning in material achievements and rational logic, the true answer might lie in simplicity and spirituality. But he still had doubts. Would it be possible to live this way in the modern world? He saw that religious people seemed to find comfort in faith, but was this just an illusion? He wanted a definitive answer, something that could be proven concretely. Tolstoy then did an experiment. He began to apply religious teachings to his life. He began to live more simply, abandoned many of his aristocratic privileges, and began to dedicate himself more to charity and helping others. To his surprise, this change had an immediate effect. He felt that, for the first time in years, his heart was at peace. He realized that true happiness was not in wealth, fame, or intellectual success, but rather in connecting with others and living spiritual principles. However, this transformation was not well received by everyone. His family and friends didn't understand why one of Russia's greatest writers was moving away from the elite and toward the peasant. Many called him crazy, others accused him of betraying his social class. Tolstoy didn't care. He knew he was on the right path. His search was far from over, but now he had a new direction. He wanted to figure out how he could live up to this new worldview. The question now was not just philosophical or theoretical, but practical. How do you turn this understanding into a truly meaningful life? In the next topics, we will see how Tolstoy arrived at his final answer and how it completely changed his way of living and writing. 3. The discovery of the meaning of life according to Tolstoy. Tolstoy spent years searching for answers, delving into science, philosophy, and religion. But in the end, his great discovery did not come from books or intellectual theory. It arose from observing the simple lives of ordinary people. He noticed that the peasants, who lived in much more difficult conditions than he did, seemed to have an inner peace that he had never experienced. They worked hard, had few possessions, and faced many hardships, but they still found joy and purpose in their...
Okay, dude, you're over 50 and waking up stiff every morning. Let's fix that in just 7 minutes a day. Starting April 7th. By April 14th, you'll feel better. By April 21st, you'll move easier. By May, your wife won't believe the results. But you just have to get started. Here's your personalized 7-minute chair workout plan, designed for men over 50. It's joint-friendly, requires no equipment, and fits your schedule. Tap the screen to start today.
Your father died, and you're sad. Come and join me. You know, when my father died, it took me a while to get over it, and I did. Now, if I'd known at the time what I know now, I could have done it quicker. What I'm going to do with you, David, if it's okay, is I'm going to do a process which is it's called a psychosensory therapy. When I touch here, just try and say it, Joe. That feels nice, yeah? That's good. So just do that because it feels comforting. Because when you were a baby, your mother held you in her arms, and she touched you here, and it hardwired you.
Rather in faith, work, and human relationships, unlike the intellectual elite, who were tormented by existential questions, peasants simply accepted life as it was and found meaning in serving others. It was then that Tolstoy understood that the true meaning of life was not in wealth, fame, or theoretical knowledge. He was in love, compassion, and dedication to others. This discovery completely changed his worldview. Tolstoy began to reject the idea that happiness came from individual success. Instead, he believed that the true purpose of existence was live for others and connect to something greater than one's own ego. This led him to develop a philosophy of life based on values such as simplicity, humility, and service. He began to believe that love was the only force capable of giving meaning to existence, and that any life lived only for oneself was doomed to emptiness. For Tolstoy, the answer to the question, "What is the meaning of life?" It was simple but profound. The meaning of life is in loving and serving. This was the only way to escape existential despair and find lasting peace. But this discovery was not just a theory. Tolstoy decided to apply this vision to his own life, completely transforming himself. He began to reject the privileges of his aristocratic class, adopting a more humble lifestyle focused on manual labor. He also began to defend a vision of Christianity based on action, not just belief. For him, it was not enough to have faith in God. It was necessary to live according to the principles of love and nonviolence. This new perspective led him to a deep admiration for figures such as Jesus, Buddha, and even Gandhi, who would later be influenced by Tolstoy thought. He saw all of these spiritual leaders as examples of people who lived to serve and transform the world around them. The idea that the true meaning of life was in dedication and love for others also made Tolstoy move away from traditional religious institutions. He began to criticize the Russian Orthodox Church, as he saw it as a power structure that did not practice the values taught by Jesus. This caused him a lot of problems. He was excommunicated from the church and suffered persecution for his ideas. But for Tolstoy, that didn't matter. He had found a truth that went beyond social conventions and was willing to follow it to the end. This new vision also profoundly impacted his literature. Tolstoy began writing stories that reflected his philosophy, extolling simplicity, compassion, and the search for the true meaning of life. Works like A Mort by Ivan Ilyich and Resurrection are clear examples of this transformation. At the end of his journey, Tolstoy came to the conclusion that the question about the meaning of life cannot be answered with words or theories alone. She can only be lived. The answer is not in the mind, but in the heart and daily action. He realized that as long as we seek meaning in reason and individual achievements, we are doomed to emptiness. But when we find meaning in love and giving to others, we experience a full and true life. This discovery did not completely eliminate his anxiety. Tolstoy still had doubts and moments of restlessness, but now he knew that the meaning of life was not something to be found, but something to be created every day through our choices and attitudes. This radical change in perspective transformed Tolstoy into one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. His philosophy influenced millions of people, and his legacy lives on today. In the next topics, we will see how this discovery impacted your practical life and what we can learn from it to apply to our own journey. 4. How did this vision influence your life and writing? After his great discovery about the meaning of life, Tolstoy realized that he could no longer live in the same way. His new philosophy demanded a complete transformation, and he was willing to pay the price for it. The first impact of this change was on his relationship with wealth and aristocracy. Tolstoy had always lived like a nobleman, surrounded by luxury and comfort, but now he saw these privileges as a barrier to a truly meaningful life. Inspired by the peasants he admired so much, he decided to give up a large part of his possessions. He began to dress simply, work in the fields, and live closer to the people. Many of his friends and family did not understand this choice, but for Tolstoy, this was the only honest way to live according to his principles. This new lifestyle also impacted his relationship with his family. His wife, Sophia, did not agree with the idea of giving up their fortune, especially since they had many children to raise. This conflict generated increasing tension in the marriage, which would become even more intense in the last years of his life. But But Tolstoy's transformation was not limited to his way of living. She also profoundly influenced his writing. If previously he was known for great novels about nobility and war, now his literature turned to spiritual, moral, and social themes. One of the first examples of this change was Amort by Ivan Ilyich, a work that reflects the anguish of a man who realizes, on his deathbed, that he has lived an empty life, focused on status and wealth, without ever having experienced the true meaning of existence. Another striking example was Resurrection, where Tolstoy denounces the hypocrisy of Russian society and defends a life based on compassion and the search for inner truth. The work was so critical of the institutions of the time that it led to his excommunication from the Russian Orthodox Church. In addition to his novels, Tolstoy also wrote philosophical and spiritual essays. In texts like Confessions and The Kingdom of God is Within You, he developed his vision of a pure Christianity, free from church influences and based exclusively on Jesus' teachings about love and nonviolence. His idea of a Christianity based on action and simplicity profoundly influenced great figures in history, such as Mahatma Gandhi. The Indian leader even wrote to Tolstoy, saying that his ideas about peaceful resistance were fundamental to India's independence movement. Tolstoy also became a fierce critic of violence and war. He began to defend pacifism and nonviolent resistance as the only legitimate paths to transform society. This stance brought him into conflict with the Russian government, which saw his ideas as a threat to the regime. His works were censored, and he was constantly monitored by the Tsarist secret police. Despite persecution, Tolstoy never abandoned his principles. He continued to preach simplicity, love for others, and rejection of power structures that oppressed the poorest. But as he grew older, he began to feel that he could no longer live under the limitations imposed by his family and society. His already shaky marriage became unsustainable, and Tolstoy began planning an escape. In 1910, at the age of 82, he finally decided to leave his home and set out in search of peace. He embarked on a journey without a defined destination, but due to his advanced age and fragile health, he fell seriously ill during the journey. He ended up passing away at the Astapovo train station in a humble room, surrounded by few friends and followers. His death was the symbolic end of his journey. He left life simply, far from riches and luxury, but at peace with himself. Tolstoy's impact on the world was not limited to literature. His philosophy of life has inspired generations and continues to be studied today. He proved that, regardless of their origin or social class, anyone can seek a greater meaning for their existence. His final years were marked by challenges, but also by an unshakable conviction that he had found the truth. He lived and died according to his principles, leaving a legacy that surpasses time. Now that we understand how Tolstoy applied his discovery to his own life, in the next topic we will reflect on what we can learn from him and how his ideas can be applied to our journey. 5. What can we learn from Tolstoy today? Tolstoy's legacy goes far beyond his literary work. His reflections on the meaning of life remain extremely relevant, especially in a world where many people still face existential crises similar to the one he experienced. But what lessons can we learn from Tolstoy's journey? The first big lesson is that external success does not guarantee internal happiness. Tolstoy had everything anyone could want: fame, wealth, recognition, and a family. However, he felt a deep emptiness. This reminds us that material achievements can bring comfort, but not necessarily a true purpose in life. Another big lesson is that seeking meaning only through reason can be a dead end. Tolstoy tried to find answers in science and philosophy, but realized that these fields explain how the world works, but do not give purpose to human existence. This finding remains relevant, as many modern people still believe that reason alone can provide all the answers to the human dilemma. Furthermore, Tolstoy teaches us that the meaning of life is not something to be discovered, but something to be lived. He realized that instead of waiting for a definitive revelation or answer, he should build purpose through his daily actions. This means that each of us can find meaning in life by focusing on what really matters. Another powerful teaching of Tolstoy is the importance of love and compassion. He concluded that living for oneself leads to emptiness, while living for others brings true purpose. It reminds us that in a world often focused on individualism, the act of helping and connecting with others can be the greatest remedy against hopelessness. Simplicity is also a great lesson of Tolstoy's philosophy. He realized that the incessant search for status, money, and material goods was an illusion, and that true peace lay in a simpler and
No sé, 27 por ahí. No, 32.
Without travel trailer insurance.
Glacial
Have your
Contempt
adventures going
Ice
in the
Strike
wrong
is a
direction.
combo.
Keep yours moving forward with Progressive. Get a quote today from a leader in RV insurance.
In a consumerist society, this reflection becomes even more relevant, inviting us to rethink our priorities. Tolstoy also teaches us that we don't need to blindly follow traditions and institutions. He questioned the Orthodox Church, the aristocracy, and the Russian government, as he believed many of these structures were more concerned with power than truth. This thought invites us to reflect on the institutions we follow and whether they truly represent the values we consider important. Another essential point is that true knowledge comes from practical experience, not just theory. Tolstoy didn't just study and reflect. He tested his philosophy in real life. This shows us that instead of just reading about the meaning of life, we should put our beliefs into practice to see if they truly bring us peace and purpose. Resistance to violence was another fundamental aspect of Tolstoy's vision. He believed that the transformation of the world should be done through peace and love, not war and conflict. This idea influenced Gandhi and the nonviolence movement, showing that his ideas continue to impact the world to this day. Tolstoy also reminds us that it is possible to change your life at any time. Even after becoming one of the greatest writers in history, he wasn't afraid to question everything and start over. This teaches us that it is never too late to seek a new purpose and live in a way that is more aligned with our values. Finally, Tolstoy teaches us that the search for the meaning of life is an ongoing journey. He never stopped questioning, evolving, and learning. This shows us that there is no single and definitive answer to this question, but rather a process of constant growth. If we apply these lessons to our lives, we can find a deeper purpose and live more fully. What Tolstoy discovered was not just an answer to his own existential crisis, but a philosophy that can guide us to this day. The final question that remains is, and you? How have you been searching for meaning in your life? Tolstoy's legacy. The meaning of life is in our choices. Tolstoy was much more than a brilliant writer. He was a man who had the courage to question everything and seek true meaning in life. His journey shows us that the meaning of existence is not in fame, wealth, or recognition, but in love, compassion, and service to others. His story teaches us that there is no single answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? But rather a path of personal discovery. Tolstoy found his truth by letting go of the ego and living more simply and authentically. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson we can learn. The true purpose of life is not something we find, but something we build every day with our choices and actions. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these Tolstoy lessons impacted you the most? Have you ever wondered what the true meaning of life is? Leave your comment and share your vision. If this video made you reflect, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next content about great minds in history. Share with someone who also needs to hear this message. See you in the next video.
Ahí en los platos.
ese escudo es el MVP.
Young Power Wash, el mejor limpiador.
Bonjour, Madame, Monsieur, everyone. If you believe in religion or divine power, you may have a clear path to life and doctrine. You may have a neat story that explains life's ultimate meaning and purpose. But what if you don't believe in God? What is your story as an atheist? How do you find meaning? One of the biggest human dilemmas are a deep urge and quest for meaning in life, yet when you ask the universe for meaning, it's like you spend your entire life writing letters to someone who never replies. At the core of every human being is this desire for meaning, but the world doesn't. Philosophers have tried to come up with a good answer. One of the most logical answers has been nihilism. There is no meaning or purpose. Then this begs the question, why live if life has no meaning? Yeah, we all do. 99.9% of us continue on living. So what is going on? Of course, some thinkers like Dostoevsky return to religion and tradition in response to nihilism. Other philosophers like Nietzsche offer artistic creativity and philosophical endeavor, but it only applies to a select minority of artist geniuses who are capable of creating values in society that transcend their own lives. What about the rest of us, the other 95% of us? Albert Camus, the French novelist and philosopher, however, offered an alternative to both religion and nihilism that applies to the majority of us. He argued that life is absurd, meaningless, and contradictory, and it sucks. However, despite its meaninglessness, absurdity, and contradiction, we feel in love with it. Why? To answer this, Camus, just like his mentor Nietzsche, returned to pre-Christian ancient Greece for an answer. Nietzsche argued that religion, Christianity in particular, had corrupted the human mind by assessing over and giving priority to authority. As a result, we neglect this, always thinking the grass is greener in heaven. The ancient Greeks, however, valued this life, despite believing in God. Today I'll look at Albert Camus' life, summarize his 4 novels, 2 of his essays, and tell you 10 philosophical ideas and secrets we can learn from his life and writings. I'll also answer why later in life Camus' understanding shifted his views away from revolutionary Marxism, an ideology he was deeply drawn to in his youth, and his philosophy for offering solution to the meaning of life for the ordinary people was highly influenced by Marxism. So sit back and pour some coffee into your French wine and let's talk absurdism and about life. Albert Camus was born on 7th of November 1913 in Algiers.
If you're sharing a hotel room with friends, you're also sharing a bathroom, and a mirror, and a tiny hairdryer. Get an Airbnb and get more space. That's basic. At City Market Pharmacy, our pharmacists are vaccine experts. Don't know what you need, or if you're covered? We can help. Most insurance plans for COVID, shingles, pneumonia, and RSV vaccines are accepted, so you can keep being the expert grandpa. City Market, a world of care is in store.
Period to a French family. His father died a year later during World War I, leaving Camus' mother to care for him and his brother. They lived in a poor neighborhood of the capital Algiers with his grandma and his sister. At primary school, he met a teacher who helped him get a scholarship to enter prestigious school in 1923. Some 30 years later, in his Nobel Prize speech, Camus dedicated the prize to that same teacher. Despite his working class background, his European heritage allowed him certain privileges like good education, enrollment in a football club that were not available to most local Arab Algerians. But when it comes to health, there is no privilege. In 1930, Camus, aged 17, contracted tuberculosis, which put an abrupt stop to his education and football career, so he moved out of his family home to avoid infecting others and went to live with his butcher uncle. For Camus, the isolation, but most crucially the illness itself, as well as seeing animals being killed to feed humans, gave him a sharp and essential focus about the nature of life. So he became deeply interested in philosophy, specifically the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer and the atheistic philosophy of Nietzsche, and the egalitarian philosophy of Marx. Through Nietzsche, particularly his influential book The Birth of Tragedy, he also discovered ancient Greek philosophers. I should point out that Anton Chekhov, the Russian genius, also lived with tuberculosis for a long period of his life. As a result, he also had a very bleak and pessimistic view of life. Both, however, turned that pessimism to optimism. Camus mostly through philosophy and Chekhov through storytelling. Not just that, both Camus and Chekhov were deeply interested and involved in theater. In 1933, Camus entered the University of Algiers, and not surprisingly, he studied philosophy and wrote his thesis on Plotinus, the ancient Egyptian-born Greco-Roman philosopher who, like Plato, emphasized ideas over matter, mind over body. Plotinus was influenced by Eastern philosophy as he traveled to Persia and learned about Indian enlightenment to study the cycle of reincarnation. Plotinus was also the pioneer of Neoplatonism, who gave Plato's philosophy an Eastern flavor by emphasizing unity of mind and body and the idea of one universal being. In his university thesis, Camus juxtaposed Christianity with ancient Greek philosophy, arguing that the Christian premise of afterlife made this life almost meaningless and redundant, because you could die at birth and go straight to heaven. Living a long life can only increase your chance of committing more sins, which could take you to hell. It makes sense not to live very long if heaven is guaranteed for babies. So basically, for Camus, most religions didn't value this life, only treated it as a test for afterlife. Camus understood that the Greeks, on the other hand, celebrated this life despite their belief in the divine power. And no surprise that Camus, just like Nietzsche, returned to ancient Greece to find a true atheistic meaning for life and wrote his most famous work, The Myth of Sisyphus, which I will discuss later. Outside study, Camus had two passions, actually three. First, he played goalkeeper in a professional football or soccer team in Algeria. As a goalkeeper, you have a clear view of the entire football pitch, which gives you a better perspective in terms of who's who and where they stand, which must have helped him with the power of philosophical and artistic observation. For Camus, football also represented a small tribe that gave him a sense of belonging and togetherness, and with a common purpose and goal, unintended. But unfortunately, his football career was cut short after he was infected with tuberculosis. Such is life. From the midst of football tribalism, he retreated to an isolated corner of a butcher's house like some injured animal. Life is really absurd. His second passion also involved tribalism, the theater, and communism. Camus in 1936 joined the French Communist Party and later the Algerian Communist Party, so he organized a workers' theater. After he was expelled from the party, he continued his theater involvement because it allowed him that sense of togetherness and teamwork. Camus was drawn to Marxism because it emphasized the group life. Later in life, he continued to work with the theater, and he famously and quite ironically staged his demons, a novel that questioned the communist revolution, which I have discussed here. By then, Camus was no longer a communist because he had grown old enough to see the other side of the communist revolution that began suppressing the individual freedom from USSR. His third passion, and perhaps the most important one too, of course, as a Frenchman or any man, was sex. He married twice, but also had a lot of sex on his side. I guess a man's ultimate purpose in life is to pass on his genes. Camus was blessed with good looks. He was handsome, masculine, and had a status as a successful writer, which allowed him access to many women. In 1940, many French were fleeing the French capital from German occupation. Camus, however, instead of escaping the combat, moved to work for a newspaper. It paid off as his writing became more popular. He grew very well known and famous. In Paris, he met the other existentialist giant Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, interesting to point out, Camus and Sartre came from two polar opposites. Sartre from a wealthy bourgeois family and Camus from a relative poverty, but both found Marxism very appealing. But later, they fell out due to the ideological differences. Sartre was keen on a Maoist-style revolution, while Camus wanted a peaceful reform. His 1942 novel The Stranger made him a celebrity, so much so that people paid to attend his lectures. Not just that, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, age 44, making him the second youngest writer ever to receive the prize after Rudyard Kipling, who was 41 in 1907. Such is the absurdities of life. When you go up, you always have to come down, just like the boulder of Sisyphus. At the height of his fame and success in 1960, while returning back from a holiday, the car he was traveling in crashed into a tree, killing him instantly. In his pocket, the police found an unused train ticket to Paris. He was supposed to travel by train with his wife and kids, but for some bizarre reason, he had chosen to travel by car, driven by his publisher, Gallimard, who also died in the crash. They also found a 144-page manuscript of his novel in progress, The First Man, an autobiographical novel about his life growing up in Algeria. Perhaps a novel similar to Proust's In Search of Lost Time, taking a more artistic approach to fiction and less philosophical. Today, Albert Camus is considered one of the most influential novelist philosophers of the 20th century. Now I'll discuss 4 of his most famous novels and 2 of his philosophical essays before I tell you 10 philosophical lessons we can draw from them. A Happy Death. Albert Camus.
Exile is now open. Stamp your W-2 and file your taxes 100% free. Plus, features roughly 37% of filers qualify. Super Form 1040 results. No schedules except for earned income tax credit, child tax credit, and student loan interest. File now.
Camus' first novel, A Happy Death, was written sometime between 1936 and 1938, but was published after his death in 1971. Basically, in this novella, Camus tried to respond to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Schopenhauer argued that on a deeper level, humans are driven by a blind will to life. We can't help but continue living despite how miserable it might be. Nietzsche thought this will to life or survival was too passive, so he changed the will to life to will to power, to energize it a bit and give it a bit of oomph. Albert Camus, however, said life is not about surviving or conquering, but it's about our deep desire to be happy. So will to happiness is the purpose of this novel. First thing, it's a short novella in 2 parts. Part 1, titled Natural Death, is about Patrice Marceau, incidentally the same name as the protagonist of Camus' most famous novel, The Stranger. He has a boring life, boring job, and a partner he doesn't really love. It's very much an early version of The Stranger. Upon meeting a wealthy yet a disabled man, he decides to kill him to take his money. This is like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, except that Raskolnikov never manages to use the money he steals. Part 2 is titled Conscious Death, depicts Marceau's life after he's rich. He still fails to find happiness despite seeking it anywhere and everywhere. At the end, he becomes seriously ill, and on the verge of death, he's finally happy. It's an ironic tale of a man seeking a happy life who ends up getting happiness when he's close to death. Albert Camus reverses natural death with conscious death. The murder in part 1 is titled as natural death because in nature death comes somewhat abruptly, while dying of an illness in part 2 is a conscious death because we are aware of it. The novel raises some important questions like how much we strive for happiness and we fail to be happy. In other words, we seek happiness but we don't know how to be happy. It's like a book collector who collects endless books but cannot read. The Stranger. Published 1942, The Stranger is Camus' most famous novel. It tells the story of Marceau, a Frenchman who lives in Algeria. The story has 3 main plot points, or 3 deaths. The death of Marceau's mother, the murder of an Arab man, and finally his own execution. The awareness of death makes humans unique in the animal kingdom, so each death awakens something in Marceau from his animal state of indifference and gives him clarity of soul. If Sartre says we are condemned to be free, Camus says we are condemned to death, but also to be guilty. So at the heart of the novel is this central question which Camus poses himself. Quote, in our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced death. In other words, Merceau is not only guilty for killing someone, but also because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral. That's the kind of man he is, emotionally unavailable, a term used by women today to describe some men. Merceau gets the news that his mother has died of old age. He takes time off work to be at the funeral, but contrary to common societal expectations, he doesn't cry or show sadness. He acts as though nothing has happened. He drinks, he smokes, and has sex with his girlfriend. He even helped his neighbor, Clement, to have a revenge sex with an Arab woman who might have betrayed him. Not only that, when Raymond is arrested for assaulting the girl, Merceau helps his friend, parroting his friend's words to the police that the woman was unfaithful. Merceau doesn't ask questions and does not think if his action might hurt someone. He simply does what he feels at the moment. In other words, he feels no guilt of what happened in the past because he is always in the present, so to speak. For example, he's shocked to hear that some people negatively judged him when he sent his mother to live in a nursing home. When Merceau's boss asks him if he wants to work in a company's branch in Paris, he says whatever. When his girlfriend Marie asks him if they should get married, his answer is the same, whatever makes you happy. He doesn't care either way. His indifferent attitude to life is a real time bomb, so Camus cranks it up a notch. One day on a beach, Merceau's friend Raymond is attacked by the brother of the Arab woman he had assaulted with a knife. Raymond gets his gun to shoot, but Merceau grabs the gun from him to stop the murder. Incidentally, none of the Arab characters are named in the novel. Whether conscious or subconscious on Camus' part, it shows the disparity of life between the French and the Arabs in Algeria back then. Later that day, Merceau, while walking on the same beach, encounters the same Arab man with a knife. Merceau still has Raymond's pistol, so he shoots the Arab man not one time but 5 times. He's arrested and put in jail. He promptly confesses to the murder. But why did you kill him? His only explanation is that the sun was too hot and bright, so he acted instinctively and somewhat reflexively. That's it. While in prison, days turn to weeks, then months and years as he waits for his trial. In court, the focus is not so much on the murder of an Arab man, but more on Merceau's inability to cry at his mother's funeral. Camus inadvertently shows the disparity of life in Algeria. An actual Arab man is murdered, yet the prosecutor is more focused on him not crying at his European mother's funeral. To be fair to Camus, he perhaps wanted to expose the legal system not from a racial viewpoint, but from an existential viewpoint. That if someone doesn't know how to cry, he's guilty. If women can cry, why can't men? That's the main question the novel poses. Because he failed to cry, the prosecutor portrays him as a remorseless monster. He's sentenced to death. As he waits for his execution, Merceau refuses to see a priest because he doesn't believe in him, and sees no physical way out of certain death. As Dostoevsky said in his novel The Idiot, in nature, when you face death, either a wild beast attacking you or your enemy in wars, there's always some hope of survival because you can battle or struggle to live. But when the state condemns you to death, there is no hope, no chance to escape. Death is the only certainty. Merceau spends days soul-searching to understand his fate. Finally, he settles on one incredible conclusion. Merceau tells the priest that we can escape from everything, but nobody can escape death. It doesn't matter how you die, but we all do. This fate is sown in us from the day we are born. This simple yet profound conclusion allows Merceau to accept his fate. Not only that, the mere act of expressing himself or yelling those words at the priest also liberates Merceau in a kind of Freudian talking therapy or church confession. He reflects, perhaps for the very first time in his life. He is finally awakened to the human condition. He was an animal, but now he realizes death as a human experience. Merceau is finally happy. Not only that, he's looking forward to the execution to hear the hatred of the crowd so he won't be alone while dying. In The Stranger, Albert Camus raises two important issues: our human awareness of death and feeling guilt. The novel has 3 deaths, one natural, one illegal murder, and one legal murder or execution. The first death, the death of his mother, arouses little in Merceau. He's also indifferent to the second death, which he causes. But when it comes to his own execution, he finally wakes up and is completely lucid. Evolutionarily speaking, humans are perhaps the only species aware of its own death, which heightens our sense of consciousness. As Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, said, the awareness of death makes human life authentic and meaningful. Albert Camus echoes that argument that death brings clarity to our lives and makes us more conscious to live a fuller life. The second issue in the novel is guilt. Meursault is on trial for the murder, but the focus is mainly on him not crying at his mother's funeral. Camus, perhaps just like his later compatriot Michel Foucault, is pointing out that modernity replaced physical punishment with psychological punishment. The pre-modern world generally punished criminals through physical ordeals, while the modern legal system stopped physical punishment for the most part and instead introduced psychological punishment by making sure one feels guilt. This is perhaps due to the modern man being too rational. Meursault is an honest man who confesses to the murder without going through the Raskolnikov ordeal of the final punishment. But his confession is not enough, so the prosecution tries to break Meursault's indifference, icy interior by making him feel guilty. So Camus says to be a modern man is not to be free, as his fellow writer Sartre said, but to be guilty and proud. Modernity on a fundamental level is an attempt to tame nature to benefit humans. But modernity also wants to domesticate men and break their spirit by making them accept guilt, feel vulnerable, and cry. So during the trial, all the effort was on making sure Meursault felt guilt. Not so much for the murder, but for not crying at his mother's funeral. Today, if men don't cry or show vulnerability or emotions, they are sometimes lived.
Pampers Swaddlers is the #1 brand for sleep, keeping your baby comfortably dry.
Gillette Clear Shield cools instantly for 72-hour sweat protection.
Felt as toxically masculine. Meursault's indifference or carefree attitude towards others makes him dangerous to society. One has to tame him. By depicting Meursault as a complex character, Camus recognized that making him feel guilty is a process of taming the wild animal, turning the wolf into a domestic dog.
Estoy mejorando un par de
While it makes
cosas.
society safer, it can also break the spirit of others. When a person is on trial, the focus is not on him, but others, making him an example to others. Judicial process is less about punishing the criminal on trial, but more about taming the rest of society through fear of punishment. Meursault is not tamed. Guilt doesn't tame him out. Even death doesn't tame him. Death makes you realize you're not a stranger, just like everyone else.
Max speed. And very important, the resonance forward that more or less instantly frees your opponents, especially in freezing mark would take. Now let's move back to the skills and supports so I can explain resonance to you and why you need it. In Act 2, you'll finally, don't worry, we're still in Act 2. We've just taken more points already than you get in Act 2. Now let's move back to the skills and supports so I can explain resonance to you and why you, don't worry, now this are just instead of bonus attack speed. And very important, the resonance keystone. Gain power charges instead of frenzy charges instead of endurance charges, and endurance charges instead of power charges. Now this might not make any sense to you yet, and you only have to take this note as you get into Act 3 and get your plus 30 spirit there. Don't worry, we're still in Act 2, we've just taken more.
¿Ya estamos en acto 3? Puta, man. Sí, muy rápido, bro. Claro.
Points already than you get in Act 2. Now let's move back to the skills and supports so I can explain resonance to you and why you need it. In Act 2, you'll finally get a tier 7 gem as well. And there, we're not taking freezing mark, we're taking Wave of Frost. Now Wave of Frost is pretty much overtaking your frozen locust. You're dashing backwards unless you're whipping freezing mark, Now let's move back to the skills and supports so I can explain resonance to you and why you need it. In Act 2, you'll finally get a tier 7 gem as well. And there, we're not taking Freezing Mark, we're taking Wave of Frost. And Wave of Frost is pretty much overtaking your Frozen Locust. You're dashing backwards, unleash a Wave of Frost forward that more or less instantly freeze your opponents. Especially potent for the Dreadnought later on. It's a get out of jail card. You can zoom through areas and then just literally freeze everyone in front of you. And for this one, I like to take Frost Nexus. When you freeze, you create chilled ground, which has everyone that is not frozen just get bonus chill and get frozen as well. And on top, Inspiration to reduce the skill cost, since the skill is relatively expensive with 67 mana, and the Frost Nexus would be another 120%. So you want to lower this. And a Wave of Frost kind of overtakes the Frozen Locust here. And as we later add a third gem slot to it, I would probably take the Ice. The Frost Nexus would be it's not frozen, just get bonus chill and get frozen as well. And on top, Inspiration to reduce the skill cost, since the skill is relatively expensive with 67 mana. And the Frost Nexus would be another 120% bonus. So you want to